The cult of scientific expertise probably went out of fashion with Oppenheimer, and it's a good thing that it did. Because the reality is that just because a scientist is great at science does not mean they know jack bleep about politics or about human nature. Again, Albert Einstein, most brilliant scientist who ever lived, was a fan of Lenin. Now, Oppenheimer was a communist fellow traveler. And the fact is that Anthony Fauci does not know about human nature. Anthony Fauci does not know what sort of decisions should be made to balance all the interests of human beings. This is why we elect politicians. This is why we don't have scientific god kings. And then the biggest retcon of all, the one that actually matters, and that answers why Rey is cool, right? It answers the biggest question. Why is Rey even a thing? And the answer is because she's Palpatine's granddaughter, which is fantastic. Okay, that's a great reveal.
Hello everyone, once again from the Tory dystopia of the United Kingdom, and today we are talking about Oppenheimer, and we spoke about Barbie like a fair bit over the last couple of weeks, but I hadn't actually seen Barbie. I saw Oppenheimer in IMAX yesterday afternoon, and I want to talk about it because something I've been hotly anticipating when I saw Ben Shapiro actually really liked Oppenheimer was him to put out his own review on his YouTube channel, because I made a video, I think my first video of the year was about why is Ben Shapiro's movie criticism so terrible. Now, anyone can not like a movie, that's fine. You can not like anything because, you know, art is subjective. I hate a lot of things people like. I don't like From Software games broadly. People absolutely love that stuff. I like loads of games people hate, and I like movies people don't like Spring Breakers. That's a great movie. Loads of people hate it. Personally, I think a lot of people don't actually get it, but, you know, I think that's good. A lot of people think that's bad. So that's fine. But Ben Shapiro's criticisms are bad. You can have bad criticisms of a movie you don't like. Like, I saw some people saying they didn't get Oppenheimer, and I'm like, I understand not getting the science, but, like, how do you just, like, not get the film? So, like, stuff like that. Or in Ben Shapiro's case, calling stuff like The Batman by Matt Reeves, like, anti-white leftist propaganda. And that's what I want to focus on today, because here we have a movie critic guy, Ben Shapiro, a failed Hollywood screenwriter, who reviews a lot of movies based on wokeness. The Batman is anti-white, this movie's woke, this movie's woke. And a lot of the time, the wokeness is like, basically like, oh, there's a black woman in the movie, woke, or Barbie hates men, woke, all that stuff, right? But we have something like Oppenheimer, which to him is a great movie, and also not woke. And why that's so amazing, if you guys haven't seen it, is that Oppenheimer was a socialist, likely a communist. Everyone in his life that was close to him were communists. Lots of people in the intellectual circles in the film are also communists. The film frames communists as good people, not woke. Communists as like the moral center of a film and a complex topic. Yeah, that's not woke apparently. But what does wokeness really mean? Because I bet if Oppenheimer went on a rant about why communism was so great, they'd all call it woke. But because he doesn't, they don't call it woke. And there's multiple things at play here. We're going to talk about it all today. Of course, the very obvious fact, conservatives don't understand subtext or perspective, because I think a lot of them watch this movie, and because it's about history, they think it's like a documentary or something. Like, there is no directorial bias in this film. There is no message in this film or political undertones about stuff. It's actually like, this is history. Oppenheimer was a socialist, and that's a fact, but Chris Nolan really doesn't have any opinion on that. And also, I just want to talk about how some people are seeing it as anti-woke, which is hilarious as well. A film about communists is anti-woke. And I think it just exposes fundamentally the conservative hypocrisy when it comes to what wokeness is, and also their inability to understand subtext. So Dune, of course, they all loved. The director of Dune coming out saying it's like anti-capitalist and stuff. They don't have anything to say about that because it's subtext. And Oppenheimer is even less subtle with the subtext, and they still don't think it's woke. Again, absolutely amazing. So what I wanted to do today is give you my review of Oppenheimer, look at Ben Shapiro's review and just break it down. Weirdly uses it as an attack on Dr. Fauci, which I thought was bizarre. And then just look at like Ben Shapiro's bad movie takes and just talk about, you know, what this film was really about. Now, before we get into my own review quickly, I want to make a clarification, right? Ben Shapiro sees himself as a movie bro, as a film bro. Ben Shapiro is not a film bro. He thinks Christopher Nolan is the best director who ever lived, which you can think, obviously, but it's pretty clear to me Ben Shapiro's film knowledge doesn't really go beyond the mainstream. And I would, I guess, call myself a film bro, but a bit more of a film bro. Like, I feel like film bros just consume, like, a lot of the mainstream movies, and they also love Chris Nolan like Ben Shapiro, but I feel like I like films even more than that. But I wouldn't say I'm like a film intellectual, because I actually do know a guy who actually is like this absolute expert on film. When you actually listen to Chris Nolan himself talk about films, it makes you realize how little films you've actually watched. I'll admit it, I'm a bit of a film snob. I'm not above mainstream movies. My favorite films are Blade Runner 2049, Her by Spike Jonze, the original Blade Runner, and for more artsy ones, I got The New World by Terrence Malick in there. I like Terrence Malick films. You know, I like Michael Mann films, which inspired Nolan. I like all the great ones, but I do have these more niche ones, which I guess I don't really want to talk about in this video, which I feel like a lot of people wouldn't have even heard of. Ben Shapiro basically feels like liking Chris Nolan films means you're a film bro. And the one thing I'll say, I know he's not a film bro. Do you know why? He doesn't know the main inspiration for like half of this movie. He doesn't reference it in his own, and that is Oliver Stone's JFK, which Ben Shapiro, I imagine, hasn't probably watched. So let's get into my own review. I really liked Oppenheimer. I felt like the first 40 minutes, way too rushed. I feel like there was actually too much going on in terms of his personal relationship with Florence Pugh's character. I feel like that was a misuse of time, because I feel like focusing on Emily Blunt, Oppenheimer's wife, and their relationship, considering he was such a womanizer, I think would have been more interesting. But that isn't really touched on too much in the film. Like, yes, he is a womanizer. The morality of that and his relationship and how it actually affects his relationship, I don't think is explored enough, to be honest. And I feel like they wasted some time on the Florence Pugh character while not talking too much about his relationship with his wife, which I feel like was way more important and also way more interesting from the brief things we did see. And the one other small criticism, I watched it in IMAX. I didn't find the audio too hard to understand, but some parts where the score, not noises in the film, the score was too loud over the dialogue. And I feel like that is like a meme of Chris Nolan films. This is the first time I've actually experienced it myself. So maybe if I saw it in an ordinary cinema, I'd be fine. To talk about like the more conventional part of like the biopic part, I did like them wrestling with the morality of the atomic bomb. I like the film, I think, pretty clearly saying that using these bombs and justified through World War II was not a good enough excuse, right? The Nazis had been defeated. Japan was likely going to be defeated soon. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan just before the A-bombs were dropped. Their defeat seemed assured. And the argument that, which Ben Shapiro is going to make, is that A-bombs actually saved millions of lives through a conventional invasion of the Japanese homeland, just really doesn't stack up. And it's pretty clear in certain scenes in the film, even a lot of the people who agreed to do this didn't believe it should be done as a means to end the war. And it seems like for Oppenheimer, he believes in nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction. So in the film, it comes across as he believes this is a solution to global peace. You have to make an example. Japan's a good example to make as any because of what they're doing in the war. And I guess people feel like they deserve it. Bomb Japan, and then the rest of the world will realize the next world war is unfeasible because of these weapons. And Oppenheimer himself knows that the Soviet Union are going to get weapons soon as well themselves. So it feels like Oppenheimer's morality in the film is through that lens. And I like them wrestling with the question because his own staff, they don't want to do this. And they realize it's a bad thing to do. And these staff are like, you know, socialists, they're trying to unionize, and they collectively all vote not to do it, basically. And the one criticism people have been leveling at this film is it doesn't show the Japanese stuff. And what people need to realize sometimes, I feel like some people don't like films enough. That's a deliberate choice, right? It's not Chris Nolan being some like massive racist xenophobe, not showing anything about the Japanese in the film, because there's a scene where everyone who worked on the project is looking at the effects of the bombs on the survivors, and it doesn't show you it. And it doesn't show Oppenheimer looking at it, because it's meant to reflect how he feels about doing these bombings and stuff. And then later on, when he's given a speech and really pandering to the crowd, saying Japan just deserved it and Germany would have deserved it, he is basically seeing the audience be affected by nuclear blasts, right? So that's the film language. And I feel like the direction of like, oh my God, it didn't show the Japanese, I don't get this criticism, to be honest, because that's not what the film is about. And the film broadly isn't just about like the end of World War II. It really goes into Cold War territory. And like I said, mutually assured destruction. And also I'm very conscious of Edward Said's Orientalism and how he talks about knowledge and power. And, you know, in the past, people in the British government would write stuff about Egypt, and then everyone would read those books and they'd all come to know certain events in Egyptian history or the Egyptian people a certain way. But there isn't that problem when it comes to Japan. Japan is massive in entertainment, absolutely a juggernaut country when it comes to anime, video games, and also one of the biggest video game franchise of all time is literally a response to the bombings. Metal Gear Solid The whole franchise is literally a response to the nuclear bombings of Japan. And you even have characters whose dad worked on the Manhattan Project and tell the player character how much they hate their father for doing this, right?
Told you my father worked on the Manhattan Project, right? August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima. August 9, Nagasaki.
The atom bomb attacks on Japan.
My father was married to his work. I don't have a single memory of going places or doing stuff with him on weekends. But even as a kid, I knew on some level that it was for his family. I respected him. My mother used to tell me all the time, "Your father is a brilliant scientist. He saved countless American boys from death. You should be proud of him."
Yeah. You could say the war ended because of those bombs.
When I was in the 5th grade, a Japanese student transferred to our class. She showed me photos of Hiroshima after the bomb. I couldn't believe my eyes. A city of over 350,000 people reduced to a scorch mark on the ground by a single atomic bomb. Houses blown off their foundations, burned to ashes. The only things left standing were the skeletons of steel-framed buildings. And it wasn't just the buildings. Blackened corpses on the side of the road. Survivors covered head to toe in severe burns. Within a few months, over 70,000 had died in Nagasaki, twice that in Hiroshima. For years after that, I couldn't talk to my father. Couldn't even stand to look at his face.
In this context of Japan versus American cinema, I feel like I don't have a problem with not seeing the Japanese reaction to this, because if I want to see that, there are loads of things that are arguably even more popular, like Metal Gear Solid, that are literally a response to these things happening, right? I'm very conscious of these things. I actually feel it's a better thing for a Western director to actually focus on the Western side of it rather than to try and make a film about the Japanese side of it, because you'd rather that come from a Japanese perspective, right? I'd rather Hideo Kojima make media about these things rather than Chris Nolan make it, because he's going to have a certain perspective which Japanese people won't have or can't relate to. So that is kind of me nipping that criticism in the bud. There is some stuff about how the atom bomb test affected local people in America, which I feel like that is a valid criticism. They probably should have touched on that. But just a bit of film bro smugness and how much better I am than Ben Shapiro. Oliver Stone is a director and a writer I really, really like. Loved his autobiography. Don't agree with a lot of his political positions, even though I do find some agreeable. And it was pretty clear straight away, the black and white scenes, that's JFK. Literally is like inspired by JFK, which Ben Shapiro doesn't seem to realize, right? So that's how I know he doesn't actually like films that much, because JFK is a very popular movie. And that is what I wasn't expecting with Oppenheimer. I didn't really expect it to basically take this more conventional biopic and turn it into like a political thriller at the end with Oppenheimer's trial interrogation about renewing his national security clearance because he was a communist, basically, right? And I really, really liked that. And I just felt good because I really noticed my girlfriend. I said, this is like JFK. And literally the last line uttered in the black and white scenes is them talking about JFK voting against Robert Downey Jr.'s confirmation to the US cabinet, right? So I felt very smug. I was like, I knew this straight away. And then literally it is a reference because the last words they say is JFK voted against this guy getting confirmed in the Senate. So I'm so smart. I'm better than everyone. No, I'm just joking. I'm better than Ben Shapiro, though. And really like the movie. And one final point, communism. The movie is about a lot of communist people who are depicted as good. Einstein was a socialist. Oppenheimer's brother was a communist. Most people Oppenheimer interacted with were communists. Oppenheimer supported the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, something that the Daily Wire actually don't. They support Franco. Michael Knowles actually recently came out and said Franco was good.
The difference here is Mussolini was a pretty bad guy. He wasn't the worst guy in the world. He wasn't Stalin. He wasn't Lenin. But Mussolini was, let's say, at least a mixed bag, leaning on the side of bad. He was a bad political leader. Franco was, broadly speaking, pretty good.
So you'd feel like an organization like the Daily Wire would see this even more woke. Oppenheimer supporting socialism. Einstein, socialist. The people he has affairs with, communists. And what I like recently is more positive depictions of communist people. We had HBO's The Last of Us, literally seeing a very functioning communist society, probably the best place to live in the world of the games and the show. And now we're seeing people in the media who are depicted as normal human beings. Now, I'm not saying Oppenheimer was like an amazing moral guy and stuff. Certainly a very interesting guy. What my point is, these communist people are not depicted as extremists. They're not depicted as far left. They're not depicted as unhinged people. they all seem very moral people. They have moral positions. They think about the collective. They think about unions. They think about the rise of fascism and stuff like that. And what I can take from this film is when Oppenheimer and his wife are like denouncing communism, I can imagine conservatives thinking they actually were denouncing communism. Not that they were just saying this to save their skins, because they were. It was the Red Scare. It was the McCarthy era. Loads of people were denouncing communism despite being communists. And Chris Nolan's messaging, it might not be pro-communism, but it's clearly showing this American patriotism, conservatism is bad and leads to bad outcomes. These communist people are the rational ones in the situation, right? They might be flawed people. They might not be great people. But at the same time, they are not bad people for being communist, and they're perfectly rational people. And their communism comes out of their own personal morality. They are the moral people in the film generally, even though the film is very complex in its morality and stuff like that. So yeah, I like the movie. Like the movie a lot. Have a lot of good things to say about it. And yeah, I would say it's fairly woke as well, because it goes against the conservative narrative about the war, shows a positive depiction of actual communist people, and shows more conservative patriotism as a bad thing. I would call it subtext traditionally, although I wouldn't really say for most people it's subtext, because it just seems to be the theme, right? Subtext is usually something you can infer from a more like subtle action. Traditionally say that subtext is really like Blade Runner being anti-capitalist, right? Like that's subtext, because it's just like the fabric of the world, and I can understand how people miss it. With Oppenheimer, I would say it's more the themes of the movie, which means any criticism of the movie or analysis of the movie has to include this because it's so obvious. But it seems like for conservatives, that isn't very obvious. So now let's get into Ben Shapiro's review after I've been waffling on about mine for a while. And I do find this very funny. And what I'm going to do right now is just watch it. It's about 30 minutes and put it on 2x speed. And then I'll just stop at the points I want to talk about. So let's get into this.
So it's a brilliant film because Christopher Nolan is just amazing. Christopher Nolan is the best living director. There is not a question about this. So basically the story of Oppenheimer, just on a historical level, is that he was granted a security clearance in order to help produce the bomb. There were serious security problems with him leading up to that, and everybody was worried about it. But they really had no choice because all the best nuclear scientists were all in bed with communists, including, by the way, Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, quite famously, was kind of a fan of Lenin. He literally said about Lenin, quote, "I honor Lenin as a man who completely sacrificed himself and devoted all his energy to the realization of social justice. I do not consider his methods practical, but one thing is certain. Men of his type are the guardians and restorers of humanity." Right? That is what Albert Einstein had to say about Vladimir Lenin. So, I mean, a lot of these people were communist fellow travelers. One reason for that is because most of Europe at this point was divided between sort of fascists and communists, right? This is exactly what happened in pre-war Germany, is that there was a divide between the communists in Germany and the fascists in Germany, and the right sided with the fascists in order to stop the communists, right? That's the story of the early 1930s and late 1920s in Germany, and obviously the Nazis end up rising to power. A lot of people who oppose the Nazis then fall into the communist camp because the communists very often would promise sort of equality of man and brotherhood. So for a lot of Jewish expatriates who had been victimized on the basis of race, they looked at communism, which suggested equality on the basis of all of this stuff, and that meant that they were trending toward the communist camp. This is why in intellectual Jewish circles, communism was very popular in the 1930s and 1940s as sort of an anti-racist routine, despite its evils.
So a very nice history lesson from Ben Shapiro there about why certain Jews would be communists, like German Jews. Oppenheimer was from German descent and he was a communist, right? And I think that is a massive oversimplification. Yes, Jews did sometimes gravitate towards communism because they were victimized so much by the ruling elite. This happened in Russia. A lot of Bolsheviks were Jewish, but because the Russian government persecuted them. But also in the context of 1920s and 30s Germany, Jewish anti-racist people, of course, sided with communists. But it wasn't a binary of fascism versus communism. Everyone knows that. Everyone talks about the Weimar Republic and social democrats and stuff like that because lots of people in Germany, including social democratic governments, liberal governments, they persecuted minorities. They didn't like Jewish people. They didn't like gay people. They didn't like all these people, right? Communists were people who stood for the rights of everyone and equality and freedom. And that's why often marginalized groups would gravitate to communism because they were the only group saying, yeah, it's the equality of man. We don't want to persecute you. We're not like the liberal capitalists or the social democrats. We will actually fight for you. So it wasn't like this binary choice where Jews in Germany were faced with, you can either join the Nazis or you can join the communists. It wasn't that binary, especially in Germany, right? I like how he downplays the communism by basically framing it as they had no other choice in this context, right? When that's not true. These people were incredibly intelligent. Literally some of the smartest people in modern history, Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer. I don't think they came to the conclusion socialism is good just because of the Nazis and stuff like that. I don't think so. I think it's a very simple and wrong framing of history to try and make it seem like these guys weren't actually like proper communists, even though he does quote Albert Einstein saying he liked Lenin's. But also just funny thing to note, he never calls his film woke, but let's keep going.
The real problem with the movie is the time in which the movie is made. So the entire premise of the movie is that Oppenheimer has created a means for the world to destroy itself, and he can't actually deal with that. And so that's the entire plot line of the movie. And all of the counter arguments to him, mutually assured destruction. We have to bomb Japan because 1 million men will die on the beaches of Japan if we don't. The notion that we have to beat the Soviets. All of these are treated as sort of bad concerns. The problem is that history proved all of Oppenheimer's critics basically right. The reality is that nuclear power has been one of the greatest achievements in the history of science. Maybe the greatest achievement in the history of science. Why? The development of the nuclear bomb itself has made wartime death extraordinarily less of a mathematical issue. Meaning that, let's take a quick example. The number of American soldiers who were killed in World War II was 405,000. 405,000 Americans died in World War II. 116,000 Americans died in World War I. The nuclear bomb is developed. And here are the casualty lists. Okay, here are the deaths by war of the United States for every subsequent war. 36,000 in the Korean War. Okay, less than 1/3 the total of World War I, and less than 1/10 the total of World War II. 58,000 in the Vietnam War. These are bloody, long wars, by the way. Really bloody, really long. The Vietnam War is 1963 to 1975. It's a 12-year war. 58,000 people dead. Again, less than 1/7 the number of people dead in World War II.
So this video is really turning into historical revisionism. So first of all, let's address his points about the bomb. He's basically saying all the critics of Oppenheimer were proven right. Like, we should have used the bomb on Japan to stop the Soviets, right? That's a good reason, apparently, to Ben Shapiro for killing like 200,000 people at least to stop the Soviet Union from helping win the war more conventionally. Like, that seriously, that is Western chauvinism 101. That you think sacrificing all these people, poisoning whole cities, destroying whole cultures basically in these cities, it's justified because you stopped the Soviet Union from invading more of Asia, basically, right? Absolutely insane logic. And also, the point about mutually assured destruction is so skewed here. Like, what's he talking about? You can't use mutually assured destruction, then start talking about the Vietnam War's low casualty rates for American soldiers. That is insane, right? If I wanted to make this argument, I would say the Soviet Union and the United States and NATO never went to war. Warsaw Pact versus NATO never happened because of mutually assured destruction, right? That's the point I would make. The point I wouldn't make is there was quite low casualty rates in Vietnam, meaning wars have been less bloody. America killed millions of people in Vietnam. Literally one of the worst wars in modern times. Millions of people they killed in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So using this as an argument that nuclear weapons prevent death is absolutely insane. Vietnam didn't have nuclear weapons, right? And in Korea, America killed like 1/3 of the civilian population of North Korea in 3 years. Millions of people. So how did mutually assured destruction help then? Like, you can talk about those conflicts in regards to nuclear weapons, more so in Korea because Eisenhower threatened to do it to China and MacArthur wanted to do it to China. But at the same time, nothing about mutually assured destruction stopped the US killing millions of people, right? The US relatively low casualty rates in something like Vietnam is because of their tactics, right? And because of being way better equipped than the Vietnamese who were waging guerrilla war. They literally dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than the whole of bombs dropped in World War II. That's why the US casualty rates were so low and the Vietnamese ones were so high. Like, this is meant to be a conservative intellectual. I've read a lot of conservative Vietnam historians, right, as part of my degree. They're not idiots like Ben Shapiro, right? This logic is insane. And if you asked any of them, do you think mutually assured destruction reduced casualties in Vietnam? They'd be like, what are you even talking about? And also, the US having nuclear weapons didn't stop China fighting in the hundreds of thousands in the Korean War either, right? Another world power that didn't yet have nuclear weapons, it still went to war with the US. So mutually assured destruction only reduces war between the major powers. It doesn't reduce war overall, and it certainly doesn't reduce bloodshed. And the low casualties of successive US wars after World War II isn't because of the nuclear bombs. And also, the US had very low casualties in World War II comparatively. The UK had the same as the US, despite being far smaller. The Soviet Union had like 30 times as many deaths. So this point is really annoying. And again, How is this guy considered intellectual? But let's go even further.
And this is sort of the outcome of the movie that's sort of weird. So the movie seems to suggest that the scientists have some sort of special viewpoint into humanity because they developed the science. That the politicians are sort of venal and corrupt and they have all these worldly concerns, but the scientists are operating on sort of a spiritual plane. The cult of scientific expertise probably went out of fashion with Oppenheimer, and it's a good thing that it did. Because the reality is that just because a scientist is great at science does not mean they know jack bleep about politics or about human nature. Again, Albert Einstein, most brilliant scientist who ever lived, was a fan of Lenin. Now, Oppenheimer was a communist fellow traveler. And the fact is that Anthony Fauci does not know about human nature. Anthony Fauci does not know what sort of decisions should be made to balance all the interests of human beings. This is why we elect politicians. This is why we don't have scientific god kings. And so there are a couple of messages that come away from the film that are sort of in conflict. One is that it's kind of bad that the scientists, didn't get to run things because the politicians were so venal and all of this.
So I obviously think it's pretty funny that Ben Shapiro thinks you can apply the themes of Oppenheimer to how Dr. Fauci handled the COVID pandemic. And yeah, there's problems with Dr. Fauci that he did, and he is like a politician at the end of the day, because you don't become that high up in government institutions without having some sort of, political awareness. But at the same time, I think the point is in the film that these scientists who create this technology, especially that scene with Truman versus Oppenheimer, especially Oppenheimer as this, someone who was raised secular humanist in his family and stuff, they realize for humanity to survive, there needs to be cooperation. That's why Oppenheimer in the film and in real life wanted to cooperate with the Soviets, tell Stalin what they had, and talk about all these arms reduction treaties and stuff, because he wanted the world to have peace, and he wanted the world, to not get into conflict with these weapons. And I'm not saying Oppenheimer should have been like the dictator of the United States, because yeah, you have politicians in theory, as elected representatives that speak for civilians, speak for the people, and they can be a check often on scientists and stuff like that. And I totally agree with that in some ways. But in terms of the politicians often, let's look at COVID, for example, which he's referencing here. What did the politicians do in multiple countries like the UK, US? They ignored scientific advice, they looted the country, and they actually killed loads and loads of people unnecessarily through their policies, right? Listening to the main advisors more in the UK for COVID and in the US, like Trump didn't really listen to Fauci. The US barely did anything, right? Basic stuff that was done across Europe, the US didn't do. And Ben Shapiro's acting like Fauci doesn't know anything. And that's why you elect politicians to actually do this terrible stuff in spite of the scientists. And let's think about climate change as well. Think of all the people who've been warning about global warming for decades. They're right? Because they understand it. They understand what's coming. Sometimes, yeah, their projections might be not as accurate as we would like, or they might be too early or too late. Whatever, science changes. But at the same time, they're doing it based on data, not based on vibes. And also often they're not just doing it based on pure ego. Like Oppenheimer had an ego, but then you see someone like Harry Truman, like pretty terrible guy, all things considered, in like both World War I and World War II. And you wonder who you would trust, someone motivated by humanism and science, or someone motivated by how to win elections and anti-communism and stuff. Not seeing the whole of the world as united, seeing all the world as split into East versus West, and you have to use these bombs like a nutcase. And yeah, Ben Shapiro's review isn't really a review of the film. It's more, how do I really warp the themes of the film to fit into my own political agenda of Dr. Fauci is bad and Oppenheimer was proven wrong by American conservatives. And he really doesn't engage with the film's themes. He's called so many things woke in his movie reviews. So many things. You'd think wokeness also applies to positive depictions of communist people, but apparently it doesn't. And then he just basically rejects the message of the film based on like his own personal conservative vibes, not realizing if he was in the film, he'd be one of the bad guys, basically. Now, let's talk about the film. I've given my review. I've given Ben Shapiro's review. Let's talk about conservative media reviews now, right? So Ben Shapiro has a history of calling so many films that on the surface aren't too political, calling them like woke propaganda. So there's a scene in The Batman where Catwoman talks about old white rich people or something, right? I forgot now. I'll play Ben Shapiro talking about it in a sec. And he just got really mad, saying this film is anti-white, it's woke. One scene where one character says something vaguely anti-rich. Catwoman, a villain and a thief, says something vaguely anti-rich to Bruce Wayne, who is super rich, right?
Like the actual Batman character hates the Batman character. And this drives me up an absolute wall. The biggest problem with the film is not the wokeness. Yes, there's some woke touches. You have Catwoman, who is a woman of color, who is, of course, good, and you have the black female mayor who is good, and you have the black Jim Gordon who is good, every white character is apparently bad, like all of them. Fine, whatever. I don't really care about that. That's fine. You have Catwoman say stuff about white privileged elites, and she makes a suggestion that Bruce Wayne is a child when his parents were killed. He doesn't really have a right to be super upset about that because, of course, he was very, very rich. That doesn't kind of rings hollow. A lot of these lines seem like throwaways for film lefty Twitter. It just feels like such a sellout. It feels like such a sellout of what Batman is supposed to be. Again, it's got a little bit of woke politics, but that's really not the problem. The problem is the broader woke orientation of the film. If the Nolan Batman was about the idea that you help innocent people by fighting criminality and provide an inspiration to people to fight criminality, if that's the idea of Batman, which it is, that's completely thrown on its head here. Matt Reeves, who's credited as both a director and a writer on the film, he does not like Batman, and I can't get over this. How do you give $150 million to a dude to make a movie about Batman when he clearly does not like Batman, when he thinks that Batman is bad, and that Batman has to be shown the error of his ways and learn to be a nicer human being? The generalized cheap left-wing sensibility is very silly with regard to Catwoman.
And it's pretty staggering when you have the two films side by side. Here you have Oppenheimer, then you have the Batman, and which film has a political message which is more woke? Like, what do you guys think? Do you think the Batman is more woke than Oppenheimer? If we're going to go with the conventional understanding that anything that promotes anything leftist, some sort of perceived liberal identity politics is bad and woke, right? So in Oppenheimer, we have communist. In the Batman, we have, I don't know, diverse cast and someone saying something about white rich people. But apparently that film is woke commie propaganda, right? Not the actual film about communist people being good. That's not woke commie propaganda, right? And this is insane. But he does this all the time. And they've done this. The whole right have done this. I saw videos from the Geeks and Gamers crowd saying that Oppenheimer was anti-woke because it wasn't diverse. It wasn't diverse at all. Just had messaging about communist people being quite all right people, actually, and quite nice people with ethics. But apparently it's every other movie. It's, you know, Captain Marvel for having Muslim superheroes. It's any other superhero movie for having a black superhero, right? That is woke. Indoctrination. Grooming, they call Lightyear for having a same-sex kiss. But no, Oppenheimer, fine. And it goes into my whole point that conservatives don't understand any subtext. And you guys might think they're grifting, right? Oppenheimer is a popular movie for the lads, for the boys. All the boys are going out to see this film because they love World War II. They love war movies, right? And if you're pandering to a male audience of people who purportedly like films, but like I was saying with Oppenheimer, I don't think it's really subtext because Ben Shapiro had to talk about the communism stuff in his review. He just said it in a weird way, right? But these other people aren't talking about it because you have to acknowledge what the film is trying to say a bit more, which Ben Shapiro ignores, but he still has to address, right? For Oppenheimer to be woke, you'd need to change Florence Pugh's character to like a black communist woman or something. Then it's woke. And she'd need to turn to the camera and say, yeah, communism is the best. And Oppenheimer will say, yes, I agree with that. Even though, you know, some of the characters kind of do say that. And with Oppenheimer, because it's a historical piece, they feel like, oh, it's just history. Chris Nolan's just showing history. He doesn't actually have any take on this stuff. He hasn't made any choices. Not that Chris Nolan could have made a movie based on Ben Shapiro's vibes that Oppenheimer was wrong, Oppenheimer was an idiot. Everything Oppenheimer said in opposition to using these bombs a lot and the hydrogen bomb, yeah, that was wrong. Oppenheimer basically was not a great guy just because he was a genius in some regards. They could have gone that way. They didn't, right? But they don't realize that's the director making a choice because they don't actually like films that much. I guess when your diet is mainly like Marvel movies, which has a very, you know, in-your-face political messaging or themes, maybe you don't understand it as much. And it also makes you realize woke stuff is good. And War Against Woke gives you terrible films like The Daily Wire's, was it Terror on the Prairie, which made no money and no one cared about. And most people who've made most of your favorite media properties were woke in some way. George Lucas, very woke, made one of the most popular franchises of all time, which these nerds constantly talk about being like better when he directed them and made them, despite the fact when he made them, all of these movies were anti-conservative, including like anti-George Bush and Dick Cheney for Revenge of the Sith, anti-US, pro-Vietnam in episode 4. Like, these people just cannot analyze films properly. The one criticism I can see myself getting in this video is, Kavernacle, you say you like Top Gun, that's conservative, so maybe Ben Shapiro can just move past his personal politics to enjoy an objectively good piece of media, right? And I would say fair enough, right? If this was anyone else, if Ben Shapiro came out and said, I realize the messaging of his film, but it's just too good for me to have hang-ups about that because of its messaging. Yeah, that's fair enough. If you're a conservative who likes Oppenheimer, despite the messaging, you don't agree with it, you can appreciate the film for what it is, then yeah, that's fair enough. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about people who will say good things are bad because they are woke, but they won't apply that consistently. So movies that don't even have much of a political message but have a diverse cast, that's wokeness. And I have to cry about that because it's anti-white. But when something actually comes along which is more complex and has a far more progressive political messaging, which you'd normally consider woke in any other movie, you ignore that for some reason or another, then yeah, I'm going to call you out for it because it's stupid, not to mention Ben Shapiro's own views on history, which come across in his review, right? So yeah, I made a whole video about why he's so terrible at reviewing movies, so go check that out. And that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think of Oppenheimer down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.